So far on this channel, we've done quite a few different comparison videos of Power Rangers in the West and its Japanese counterpart, Super Sentai. And while it took Hayao Saban a few attempts to be taken seriously by US TV producers before they finally greenlit Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, his persistence paid off as Power Rangers became one of the biggest kids' TV shows of all time. So much so that the only natural next step for Saban would be to look at what else there is out there that could be adapted into a US show. While we got things like VR Troopers, we'll get to that one, arguably the most obvious adaptation to be made was that of Kamen Rider. Now, we're not going to go into a full history of Kamen Rider here, partly because I don't know the full history of Kamen Rider, but I do know how important and influential it is. Not least because we were talking about it going back to the Japanese Spider-Man review. The thing is though, Kamen Rider never really took off over here. That's not to say Saban didn't try though, when in 1995 they introduced us to Masked Rider. Given the success of Kamen Rider in Japan, they were justified in feeling confident in its potential. So much so that they even gave him his debut alongside the Power Rangers themselves. But we'll get onto that in a bit, because unlike our Power Rangers vs Super Sentai videos, I'm actually going to start with the Japanese show first and go back a bit further. The thing is, it's a little tricky. You see, I said in my Mighty Morphin Power Rangers vs Kaku Ranger video that Masked Rider was based on Kamen Rider Black, which technically it is, and also it isn't, because it's actually based on Kamen Rider Black RX, and also it isn't. This is going to take a bit of explanation. To be honest though, given that I also run a motorcycle YouTube channel, I'm surprised that it's taken me this long to get around to it. But basically, there's two series. Kamen Rider Black RX is the sequel to Kamen Rider Black, and while it is a direct sequel, the two are quite different in tone and approach, and they can almost be treated separately. But given that they are sequels, we're going to have to take a look at both. So, for part one, let's explore the original Kamen Rider Black. Black starts with two brothers who are supposedly being transformed into cyborgs to fight for the evil Gorgom. One of the brothers is seemingly killed along with their father, and the other brother, Kotaro, tries to run, but is pursued and beaten badly until he transforms into what these villains call Century King Black, or just Black Sun. A motorcycle appears for him, but he is also a biker outside of his henshin. They're not connected though. The bike doesn't transform, it just appears. He has a road bike, and then when he transforms, he just has a different one, called Battle Hopper. Battle Hopper isn't just a machine, it's also a living being with the ability to regenerate and to sort of talk. Although, if I was working for Suzuki in 1987, I definitely want a henshin to be hinted at in the story. That's a GSX-R 400, or maybe a 250, but either way, it's a relatively entry-level bike. Can you imagine being a teenager or a young guy in his 20s and getting Kamen Rider's bike? In fact, I want one. Bertie, if you're watching this, I might have a new project for Totally Motors. Turns out though, his father isn't actually dead, neither is his brother. But his father is a member of Gorgom, and he confesses that Kotaro isn't actually his biological son either. His brother, Nobiko, is his father's son, but Kotaro was the son of some friends who were killed in a car accident, but he then raised them as if they were twins. However, they choose some strange footage to illustrate this, showing the brothers as basically grown men, naked in the shower together, and then one drops the soap. Luckily, that can't be read into as anything other than literal. No suggestive imagery going on up there. Gorgom offered to become investors in their respective research, but Kotaro's father refused, leading to his death, and Nobiko's father basically sold the boys, or probably more accurately, used them as collateral. Monsters then start appearing and the father is killed, again. Kotaro then transforms using, I guess, some kind of morpher that is now built into his body. And then he beats up these spider-type guys on the bike, which we now know is called Battle Hopper. We then get back to the origin story with Kotaro and Nobiko both being turned into Century Kings, one with a red kingstone and the other with a green kingstone. At this point, we don't really know what Gorgom's motivation is, other than wanting to destroy mankind, of course. They also create monsters called kaijin, which can live up to 50,000 years. They're basically mutants that take the form of semi-humans combined with animals. Not always animals, but mostly. In episode 3, we learn a bit more about how the brothers got into this situation. Kotaro and Nobiko were chosen to create 2 separate Century Kings, who would then duel, the winner taking the throne as the new Creation King. We don't really know what the Creation King is yet, and we don't know the condition of Nobiko, but regardless, with Black's son gone rogue, Gorgom can't let him live, and so begins the Monster of the Week cycle to try and kill Kotaro. Jumping forward to episode 12, there is talk of a new bike called Road Sector. I don't know why Gorgom, with all of their technology, like bikes so much, but same. It was manufactured by someone who was also pressured by Gorgom for research money, and it is made out of the Suzuki. Oh, get me eBay. This is going to be expensive. The bike is every 80s cliche rolled into one, and I love it. It might not transform from a road bike, but it is based on Kotaro's road bike. It's just that it's a permanent change, it's not a henshin-based change. It also has a face like Alpha 5 in the 2017 Power Rangers movie. Anyway, it's quite normal for a series like this to have 10 episodes or so of filler before introducing something new. Usually that's a Zord, but in this case, there are no Zords, just the bikes. There's no need for giant mecha in this show, as the mutants never grow giant. Which is kind of a shame, but then again, it's also nice to see something different. I'm obviously going to keep comparing this to Super Sentai, which is fair, but this was running alongside Masked Man and Live Man, spanning the two, so it had to be different enough to stand on its own. It's one thing to compare them 35 years later, but in your mind you have to go back to 1988 and think about what it was like having this in the same lineup as Super Sentai, broadcast on over-the-air TV. They sit alongside each other and have similarities, but they are their own thing. It also sat alongside other shows, but that's for another time. Oh, and there's that National Park bridge again. Yeah, they share some of the filming locations too. Now, technically, it wasn't Gorgom that made Road Sector. It was again the product of funding someone else's research and then stealing it for themselves. When it chooses Kotaro, they attempt to replicate it themselves, but it doesn't work out very well. They get close by blackmailing the student of the guy who built the original, which does work, but he sabotages it so that it doesn't last long. In episode 17, we get an update on Nobiko's condition. For some reason he's weakening and needs a new life force from someone that shares his blood, so Gorgom goes after his sister, Kyoko. It's not exactly clear whether Kyoko now knows that Kotaro isn't really her brother, but I think she does, as she now refers to him as Kotaro-san as opposed to Oni-chan, or older brother, which she still uses for Nobiko. But it's not really important at this stage. They attempt to steal her life force by tricking her into giving it willingly. She doesn't die though, she escapes, and in the meantime, the current Creation King begins to stir. We still don't really know what it is yet. And to be fair, it doesn't really matter yet, because he only really stirs to insist on the release of someone called Birogenya, a villain that was locked away in a cursed casket with echoes of the Mummy, which isn't by accident, as there just happens to be an Egyptian exhibition in town. Although he doesn't really add much to begin with, he's just another villain to fight to refresh the series. After all, this is just killing time until we get back to the main storyline later in the show. But it does add the obligatory rivalry within Gorgom, where the High Priests and Birogenya both want to be the ones to take down Kamen Rider. There's a weird thing later in the series where they also try to use Nobiko's girlfriend to help revive him, but unlike with Kyoko, where they insist she has to do it of her own free will, they don't really bother when it comes to Katsumi. And then fast forward a few more episodes and they drop all pretense and just kidnap Kyoko. Just because she gave consent once doesn't mean that it's a recurring thing. There's a lesson there. Now, you might ask, why not just kill Nobiko and use the King Stone to make Kyoko into the new Century King, Shadow Moon, seeing as her life force is wanted so badly? But it's not that simple. The Century King has to have been born under a solar eclipse, because reasons. But Birugenya was also born under a solar eclipse, so he takes control of the Creation King's sword and tries to undermine the whole Century King duel thing. So the Creation King suggests using the elemental stones that give the High Priest life to resurrect Shadow Moon, or Nobiko. Their sacrifice finally revives him and he emerges as if he was Robocop. He kills off Birugenya fairly quickly and sets his sights on Black Sun. With the High Priests sacrificing their lives through the stones, they then die, but are reborn as extra strong Kaijin. This starts the cycle of filler over again for a few episodes, with a new leader and new subordinates trying to take down Black Sun. And one by one they're killed, with a little help from a whale mutant who turns his back on Gorgom when he learns that the oceans will be destroyed. In return, Black Sun saves his life by getting him to the ocean in order to recover. We also learn that the Creation King's life is somehow connected to the longevity of a sunspot. The new Creation King must be chosen before the sunspot fades. We have to wait until episode 47 before Black Sun finally fights Shadow Moon, but Shadow Moon actually wins, although he can't bring himself to rip the Kingstone from Kotaro's body, which was a mistake because without it he can't ascend to the throne. Either way, Kotaro seemingly dies. What I find interesting here though is that they acknowledge that at this point it's exclusively a Japan problem, although obviously it's only a matter of time before other countries are attacked. Regardless, Japan descends into chaos with people trying to flee the country. Even Kyoko and Katsumi leave, on Kotaro's instruction. However, it's not over yet. Returning the favour for his escape, Whale Mutant nurses Black Sun back to life. We like Whale Mutant, he's a good one. Unfortunately though, he doesn't make it. He ends up getting killed fighting Gorgom, but not before showing Black Sun how to find the Gorgom headquarters. In the penultimate episode, we see the Creation King's true form, a sort of heart with ribs, or something. And the final battle for control begins, with Battlehopper becoming the first victim. In the end, the battle is fairly short, with Shadow Moon being defeated, but he does forfeit the sword back to Black Sun, allowing him to destroy the Creation King. And that's kind of it. We don't really know what happens to Shadow Moon. We're left to assume that he dies, but it cuts away quite abruptly and we're left unsure. We see the headquarters blow up and Kotaro sort of says goodbye to his old life, but we don't really get a full picture of what happened. It ends quite quickly and we just have to wait and see what happens in Black RX. Although you have to remember that when this initially aired in Japan, that wait was only 2 weeks long. Now, there's not actually a lot of story in Kamen Rider Black. The series is fairly episodic, or to put it another way, there's a lot of filler between the bookends of the early episodes and then when the showdown with Nobiko comes back to its head. But even so, it's still really good. It just goes to show that you don't need a deep story to make it work. A simple story can still produce something enjoyable, and it reminds me a little bit of the Japanese Spider-Man show, because that was also very episodic. In fact, there's other parallels, like the Rider being a lone hero, but then he does have an ally in the form of an Interpol agent. I assume that's where the idea comes from, although if I watch more, maybe it's a common trope, I don't know. The series is enjoyable, but as a fan of Super Sentai, Power Rangers and the Japanese Spider-Man, I do feel like the lack of mecha is a little bit disappointing. Although, as a biker, I also appreciate the sheer amount of motorcycle footage. After all, he's Kamen Rider, and he does live up to his name. The thing is, I like well-written characters, and that's maybe why I tend to gravitate to ensemble teams. Although, granted, that's only when the whole team is well written, as opposed to just one or two of them, as was my issue with Jetman. Even though I did like that series too, I felt like the main characters weren't that likeable, and the ones that were didn't have enough written for them. But despite most of the series being Monster of the Week stuff, it's all pretty good. I have to admit though, I don't know how they got away with an episode where Gorgom used Famicoms to pull children through TVs to be turned into child warriors. That doesn't sound like good marketing to me from Nintendo's perspective. Although, having said that, there was actually a Famicom Disk System game, so maybe this episode had something to do with that? It's not clear. Now, an important point. Throughout the series we see references to grasshoppers. They were all over the boat when the twins were first introduced to Gorgom, and they used grasshopper wine to brainwash some victims in episode 7, plus a few other appearances. And if you hadn't noticed, Black kinda looks like a grasshopper himself. Not to mention his bike is called Battle Hopper. And you might be wondering, why a grasshopper? Well, there's a very simple answer. We don't know. We never find out. It's not strictly addressed. As far as I can tell, it's just tradition. The original creator's son suggested that it should look like a grasshopper way back in the 70s, and so many of the Showa-era riders did. In the context of the show, the only reason I can speculate is that it somehow works in a similar way to mutants in Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, at least the cartoon anyway, where their mutations are dictated based on animals they've recently interacted with. And so it goes with all of the Kaijin, but that's just my theory. It does fit with many of the other Kaijin in the show though, as we see similar monsters based around a cicada, a praying mantis, and an earwig. And bug collecting was quite a popular thing for children in Japan at the time. That's the basis of Pokemon after all. There's a whole episode dedicated to it as well. And then there is also an episode set on Kauai where there's someone whose powers are based on their ancestors' ability to drive out grasshoppers from Hawaii, or something. Now, there is a manga based on the show, but it doesn't offer much more explanation. The manga version of Kotaro just appears to have been experimented on and is now the rider, although they do explicitly refer to him as a grasshopper monster. And also in the manga, I don't think he's a cyborg. He looks more like he's a full-on kaijin, as he seems to transform into an organic being. He even gets undressed first. It doesn't seem like a henshin, but maybe it is. Maybe I need to read more. In the show, they do, however, attempt to explain his looks in terms of the powers that he has. The large red eyes are to massively increase the strength of his vision, while the antennae allow him to detect movement around him when his vision is impaired. And the symbol on his chest appears to be a Gorgom symbol, as a group of youth soldiers is rescued and they all wear that symbol too. Although they're not actually children. They were, but they're being kept young by Gorgom. They crop up again as allies known as the Shonen Warriors. It's actually quite a good way of including kids in the show and turning them into heroes. Unlike, I don't know, turning them into a ranger. Not all the Kaijin are actually based purely off animals though. You get the sense that whoever wrote the show was a big fan of classic monsters. There's a Kaijin like the creature from the Black Lagoon, with scenes that are genuinely scary. And the manga features more obscure mutants that look like the Phantom of the Opera, or even a monster that tears away at the wing of a plane while in flight, a bit like the episode of The Twilight Zone with William Shatner. And then there's the episode that takes inspiration from Poltergeist and The Exorcist. And to be fair, never mind monster movies, there's even a scene where they're basically fighting with lightsabers. Now, there were a couple of movie specials, but more notably, there was also sort of a remake in 2022 called Kamen Rider Black Sun. This is an 18+ retelling of the story, and full disclosure, this was just meant to be kind of a footnote at the bottom of this script. We're not really here to compare that to anything here, and yet I can't not talk about that because it's one of the best things I've watched in a long time. But there's a lot to talk about, so I'll save that for its own video. Well, now we know what Kamen Rider Black was all about, we can address the more pressing question, what is Kamen Rider Black RX, and how does it compare to the American counterpart, Masked Rider? Join me in part 2 to find out.